I'm going to start because time is of the essence. So I'm not going to do an introduction, extensive introduction. So I'm just going to name it very quickly, right? I'm going to say it's a great honor, right? And we are very happy to have Cruz Garcia and Natalie Frankowski, both of White Think Tank. And I'm just going to leave it at that. And he's going to be part of the next. Thank you so much.
So we didn't want necessarily an introduction because the presentation is like the introduction, and I don't know how many of you have seen this documentary before, and hopefully people will come in. If they miss the beginning, they still can see the documentary. How many of you have seen this documentary before? Only one person in the audience. So this is Aquí Vive Gente. So do you know Bad Bunny? The Puerto Rican musician, trap singer, Latin trap, reggaetonero, whatever. 2 years ago, he released this video, part of his album, and we were all waiting for his video. And then, like the same day he dropped it, I was watching in the computer, and then we saw like there's a lot of millions of people already watched this today, but this video lasts 20 minutes, and we were wondering like, did he do like a Michael Jackson type of video or something like that? And then we realized that he have commissioned Bianca Grau, that is an independent journalist. He has seen her work online, and the team called her, and she thought it was a scam, and then it ended up being real, where he wanted her to talk about 3 things that are afflicting Puerto Rico as part of his music video, because he's so famous. Then people can learn about the ongoing colonial situation in Puerto Rico. And then the video focused on the privatization of the electrical grid, basically privatization and the dispossession of homes from people, and the privatization of beaches, right? So what was really interesting about this, and I think in the context here in San Diego and Tijuana, is that Bad Bunny video really revealed to the world, like we always knew it, the connections of how colonialism makes connections around the world, right? I come from the world's oldest colony. Puerto Rico was invaded in Christopher Columbus' second trip. And we've been a colony ever since, right? 400 years from Spain, 120 something years from the US. And it connects, to the things that we were talking about walls, monuments that are racist monuments, right? Like monuments to empire, monuments to the ecological destruction, about ecological spoliation, social fragmentation, and so on, right? And something that we had to understand when we talk about this is that these things they're not isolated. They're part of an infrastructure that is planetary. Colonialism is a planetary infrastructure, and it has effects that you can compare in a way, right? Like that's why people that want you to only focus on one place and a history of certain years, I always find very problematic, right? Because then it makes us miss the overall infrastructure, right? Like the solidarity of white supremacy is something real. And which brings us to maybe to the most urgent crisis today, right? That is a completely architectural fabrication, right? In the case of occupied Palestine and the construction of the state of Israel, with all the infrastructures of oppression, segregation, apartheid, racialization. And I put these 2 images here because this is the very bizarre thing that happened this week, that Joe Biden, the president of the US, is offering a long-awaited apology for the history of Indian boarding schools, basically acknowledging one genocide many years later, while they're actually doing another one, right? Like this is like a US genocide being done in Palestine, right? With our money, with the weapons that are manufactured here, and with full permit and complicity of the United States, right? Complete destruction of a people and a place. And why do architects don't talk about this is something that we ask ourselves. And we had the chance to publish this essay a couple of weeks ago in the Avery Review that is called Cowardice as Architectural Theory, right? How to think of cowardice as a position, right? In architecture that has a really long history of architects always avoiding the important issues of the time, whatever they are, right? In the 60s, they were not talking about whatever was happening in the 60s. In the 90s, they were not talking about whatever was happening in the 90s. And now we are doing it again, right? We go to every architecture series, lecture, and so on. It looks like nothing is happening as children are being blown to pieces, right? So about today's lecture, and I wanted to set it like that, right? So it's a serious, on a serious note, about loud reading. What does loud reading means to us? And we like to start with something that we call biographical notes, right? Who are we? Why we don't want an introduction necessarily?
So sorry. Today, usually I have a team of a loud player. Today she's a loud sleeper. So I'll do my best to join the conversation as a loud reader. We partition the presentation of today in chapters, and our first part deals with the idea of history. So history doesn't exist. There is no post or pre in this vision of history that is not linear or teleologically, but rather moves in cycles and spirals and sets out on a course without neglecting to return to the same point. The indigenous world does not conceive of history as linear. The past future is contained in the present. The regression or progression, the repetition or overcoming of the past is at play in each conjuncture and is depending more on our acts than on our world.
This is a quote by Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui, right, a Bolivian philosopher, and it talks about time. That for us is really important. It's something that we're always discussing. And just to give you a bit of background, it's the three of us, right? I'm Cruz, Natalie, and Emma that is sleeping under Natalie's shirt. And this is really important, right? Because it relates to our practice and our way of thinking. This is a letter that we wrote to our daughter to explain the origins of her name when she was born, right? That we were collaborating with the Funambulist, that is a magazine of politics and architecture in France. And they have asked us to contribute a piece. And then our daughter was just born. And all we can think about was our daughter was just born. So we asked the editor if we could actually just, an issue that had to deal with land, from settler colonial property to land back. We could write a letter to explain to her the origins of her name, right? Emma from Emancipation, Jusarix being a sort of Taino Afrofuturist name, and try to explain to her through these images and the text how the two institutions we work in mostly, that are universities and museums, are mostly going to try to lie to her about her history. And we wish that she can use her name to trace her origins somehow, right? Even if I don't know where my origins are, I know that they all scatter. I'm the product of human trafficking, from indigenous people in the Americas and indigenous peoples in Africa. So how can we use architecture in a way as a device to challenge time? When we talk about history, I was getting so nervous. Like, what do you mean 130 years of history? What does that mean, right? To the histories that are not encompassed within those frameworks, right? Of empire and the superpowers, right? So in a way, like, we made this map, a diagram that maps our practices and how they relate, like from teaching. It comes from a Vejigante mask. That is a Puerto Rican practice that was kind of reappropriated from a kind of racist colonial Spanish practice, and for us has a completely different meaning, mostly connecting to indigenous and African sort of narratives. And we try to explain all the ways in which we operate. That is through teaching, through like all the places where we live around the world, willingly or unwillingly, to the origins, right? I come from extremely impoverished parts of Puerto Rico, and the history of my family in relationship to those places, to the origins of where we met. We met in 2008 during the financial crisis of Wall Street, which is a very interesting year to become an architect. Finish school, and again, we in the last 16 years we've been all around the world, kind of. Live I studied in Puerto Rico, Natalie studied in France, we met in Belgium, live in China for 7 years. These are some images of our apartment when we lived there, and it's like shows a bit the intensity in which we live, which there's no separation of like art and life. And we would do events in our apartment. Sometimes people thought it was we used to run a gallery. People would show up in our apartment. It's like, this is our apartment, but whatever. Since you're here, welcome. And right here is the image with Blinky and Pasha. So we went from living in a city of 20 million people to waking up the next day in the middle of Wisconsin. As somebody mentioned Taliesin today, which was kind of funny to me. It was like, what? Taliesin. So our first experience in continental US was living in Taliesin, right? We came to teach in the Frank Lloyd Wright School of Architecture, right? And Frank Lloyd Wright built this school in the land of his aunties that used to have like a Montessori sort of school here in the rolling hills of Wisconsin. And it was a really shocking experience for many different reasons, other than this place is haunted by many ghosts, including the ghost of toxic patriarchy. And it was a very challenging thing for us because we were thinking, how do we challenge this idea of the singular male genius that is going to change the world with this architecture, right? Which is like, makes me want to throw up if I think about that. And how can we offer a different form of education in this space, right? It was a very hostile space at the beginning. Students wanted to kill us when we were trying to say, like, we're not going to do like Frank Lloyd Wright. It's like, how dare you? At the end, it ended up being a really interesting exercise. One of the projects we made with our students, we kind of forced them to do it, was to make a magazine that couldn't be about Frank Lloyd Wright. And it almost cost our lives. And it's the only project that is still ongoing from the school, right? They got kicked out of Taliesin. They are in Arcosanti now. And the students are still running WASH. So in a way, at the end, we won. Haha. We were working with high schoolers in Arizona, right? Because they also have this indigenous land that Frank Lloyd Wright took to make Taliesin. And our students will do interesting projects there where they will question the material history of the place, the ecologies there, the narratives of history, the materials. And this to show you that doesn't matter what you say about Taliesin, BBC is still going to make a documentary and title it Frank Lloyd Wright, the man who built America, right? It's not what I'm saying in the documentary. But there is this really emphasis on trying to create the idea of the genius that is going to transform the world.
And through also like a lot of different experience and the question of education, which was wonderfully also discussed before in the panel in a more critical way, is something also very early on that we wanted to do is also engage as much different publics and makers of cities and of worlds, right? World makers from very different backgrounds. So we did a lot of workshop with kids, which we love. We create books, children's stories. We also work with them on creating stories, installations, and it's also and again, as we're saying that one of our collective motto is, we are all students, like we are all teachers too, all students, all teachers. And for us, the kids always teach us a lot about, our current situations, how people live, how we can connect together, how can we build. This was one of the most fun projects we did. We had this huge installation with blocks, and we asked, we just let the kids build themselves, organize, and so on. And it was really inspiring to see them doing it. And
it's a kind of transformative project. So teaching for us is really important, but not only teaching in universities. Like this, for example, when we teach in university, this is one of the projects we did in 2020 when we were teaching Carnegie Mellon. And it was kind of interesting because the students were really taking the pulse of the time. This is before George Floyd. And just as COVID was starting, right, our students were already thinking about what does education for Black liberation looks like, or what is an education for protest look like? Like, how can you train people to learn how to protest in a certain space, right? Or what was the role of social media and surveillance, right, in technology? It's kind of weird to look at this now because it was really like a premonition of many things that were changing from that year, working with land issues or this, I love this project. One of our Chinese students is from the US, right, with Chinese heritage, making this basically monuments of the American dream, of the fallen American dream, as a New Yorker. Really interesting way to think about it. Or when we teach, for example, in Columbia, in New York, in the summers, we teach in the advanced architectural design program. And we mostly focus there studying the colonial footprint of institutions in New York, including Columbia University, which some of our students have studied, the colonial footprint of MoMA, of the Met, of Columbia, right? And I think everybody can see now with the police repression of the student encampments. It's quite brutal. I don't want to go again. It was a very strange thing to be there in the summer. And, you know, even now, one of our students that made this beautiful project that was studying he was tying the collection in the Met to stolen artifacts from Cambodia and how they were funding the genocide in Cambodia by the Khmer Rouge. And just as he made this fantastic video, and we have all these juries that work, you know, funding museums and so on, 2 weeks later, the district attorney of Manhattan actually confiscated the artifacts. It was all true, right? And it really shows you, he was rendering all the office spaces in the Met, more discrete spaces, not the ones we see, to show that that's where the actual violence takes place, right? That's where the contracts are signed. That's where the looting is documented. Really fantastic thing, but it shows you that education can be this sort of liberatory practice, or that's at least how we think of it, right? Media plays a really important role in everything we're doing.
I just also want to go back briefly on what we like the few projects that we showed also that we are doing in studio, because I think also it ties to some questions that were raised during the panel discussion previously. Is like also how, you know, important it is not to always run away from architecture, because, you know, when we ask sometimes difficult questions, we would like to just disappear, right? Because, and again, it's like, you know, how so can we be ourselves critical of our own fields limitations, but also what's interesting and what is also we learn a lot through the works of the students is how can we still, you know, place architecture and all the spaces that are linked to architecture to these very political and very critical questions.
Right. And we do this through different ways, and you've seen some already, like teaching is a really important one. It's kind of funny because all of our parents are teachers at different levels. So it makes sense that we also teaching, right? It's something that is part of our upbringing, whether I was going to be an architect or an engineer, but I'm here because of that elevator. Publishing is one of them, right? And it goes from publishing our first, you know, magazines that we used to self-publish to like books now that are done with commercial publishers, right? Where we are getting kind of like advance payments and all that stuff, right? And how are all these things connected, right? Like through editorial work. So everything always has this angle that tries to be critical, right? Way the WAI in our practice comes from what about it, right? That is always about asking questions, which was also the first magazines we published on our own, right? It started in 2011, all the way to 2016. And we don't, you know, even when we work with academic journals, which I truly hate, right? I think we try to force them to do what we wish they were, right? We edited an issue on reparations a couple of years ago with some really fantastic people. And probably, I don't know if you've ever seen this, maybe to some of the faculty, but there's not a single white page in this publication, right? They all have different shades of black, of skins of, this is not really written anywhere, but it's coming from different people that, like, you know, James Baldwin and stuff like that. So even the design was thought out, right, in a different way than other journals. And we could talk to really interesting people. I know that they're really good because most of them are banned in Florida, which is awesome. So like, we're talking to Kianga. She's banned in Florida. We're doing our the right job, right? We have an Informa journal coming soon with a really awesome set of contributions, you know, all the way from Palestine to Brazil, to, you know, Puerto Rican Black Panther in Buffalo. We just launched this week, actually, a loud reading series on eFlux. That is, I think, we're going to take credit for this in architectural discussions. It's centered in the Caribbean for the first time that I know of. Even in the Leslie Loco Biennale, there's no Caribbean representation. So that's always been kind of, although we receive 40% of enslaved Africans, when diasporic these conversations come about, the Caribbean doesn't exist in architecture, right? So we're trying to change that. I feel like the Caribbean relates to everybody, right? It relates here to San Diego, it relates to Tijuana, it relates to like Empire. We just published also this double issue of From Land Grab to Land Back that is part of a series of publications we are producing. That is part of a series of conversations. Juliana was a part of one of them, and there's projects how this extend. How we think about the Caribbean, and this is a theory you will see how we apply it in different things. Is not as a place, but rather as a program, right? The plantation comes from there. If you are affected by colonialism somehow and white supremacy, you are related to the Caribbean somehow, right? And we are in Iowa most of the year, where we teach in Iowa State. That is a land grab institution, which is here in the middle, right? Connected by the Mississippi and the Missouri River, which ends in the greater Caribbean region, right? The Gulf is part of the greater Caribbean region. And that's a way to think about the world in a different way, right? We're not necessarily in the periphery, but rather everything comes from us, right? All of our suffering, but also all of our resistance too, right? When we do Loud Readers, we try to be very planetary. So there's a bunch of maps here. These are all the participants in the last year. It's quite a lot, right? So we don't sleep that much. But we always try to continue asking these questions, right? Working with indigenous activists in the Great Plains, like now we're working with the Great Plains Action Society on questions of rematriation. Done a couple of exhibitions in Iowa State that bring these questions of land back, to the institution, which I think is kind of cool to do it in the belly of the beast. We're working right now with them. This project is not published or anything, but we're trying to get them an indigenous center of resilience, in Sioux City, where 78% of the indigenous people don't live in their reservations, but rather they're urban living with all the poverty and the challenges that it comes with that. So these projects, they take many different forms, right? We've been working with anti-racist activists in Puerto Rico, with indigenous activists also in Puerto Rico, and this is almost like a new discourse we have, although we've been told that indigenous people were eradicated somehow, which is wild, because when we do DNA tests, it's obviously not true. And all these discourses are being brought up for the first time, right? So these are kind of like groundbreaking conversations taking place. We also did a couple of workshops in South Africa. As you can see, Emma was there active drawing her diagrams, and end up also in the publication, right? Mapping all these questions about land back. These conversations are quite traumatizing. I think every single time we've done them, people cry. Because it's serious, right? Like it involves, women getting kidnapped, and killed. And it involves people not knowing where they come from. It involves families being separated, Somebody was today was talking about the wall running through different parts. Sometimes the wall is running literally straight through you, right? Like through your personhood, through your being, right? And that's why I think of these monuments as being so violent in a way, right? We have done all this, this part of the exhibition. So we did a full week of events in Iowa State with, Dimas Ruggi from Palestine, from Marakiani, Olivieri, talking about, she's the only architect from Vieques. Vieques is an island in the archipelago of Puerto Rico that was bombed for over 70 years by the US military, with thousands and thousands of bombs every day. This after having a history of violent plantations there. Everybody in that, although the US military says that there's no toxic contaminants, everybody has uranium in their blood, right? And out of her class of 120 people, 10 have died of cancer in their early 30s, right? So we're trying to somehow use whatever tools we have so they can talk about this, this real material history that sometimes we completely ignore. When she came to our lecture, she showed her medical tests, right? This real stuff. And she's the only architect by training, right? It's really difficult to go from Vieques. Puerto Rico is disenfranchised by the US. Vieques is disenfranchised by Puerto Rico, right? There's layers of privilege and oppression, right? That always are in play, right? So she writes about it in the journal. We have this all these exhibitions that we do in the gallery there in Iowa State. I think they are quite, we have one right now that is a title of Ailton Krenak, that is a Brazilian indigenous philosopher, Ideas to Postpone the End of the World, and we added the machines to it, and we running this show in the gallery also, right? And having a program around it is a continuation of those land back questions. Emma was posing for us that day It's a pretty cool series. There's like playground things, collaborators, friends, people that we studied their work, and we try to get all these things there. She's showing her tattoo. Right. So they are quite mysterious and sci-fi shows. Relates to the first show we ever did, right? Just out of school back in 2011.
And to kind of go back in a loop in how also we started, how we moved around, but also a question of media, right? How we, from publication to workshop to exhibition, and to the title of our practice, how also it's a lot about, asking questions and trying also to find a collective with whom to ask those questions, right? And also acknowledging that, and again, like we, as a collective, we find, somebody's waking up. we can find more power, right? And learning from also different places, different practices. And also, I think what was very fundamental for us is having a collaboration with people from different fields that is not just architecture.
And so this is a picture of the first show we ever did. Nobody asked for it, right? 2011. This is for the students mostly, right? We were like writing and making things on our apartment. And we said like, we need to present this to the world. And then the world doesn't care who you are. They don't know who you are. It doesn't matter really. All right. So we went from doing these things, buy a couple of IKEA tables, get a gallery space somewhere, make some models home, show the things there. And you can see this collage in the back. I think like it will make a comeback many different times. You'll see like after 2015, we got invited to do the first Chicago Biennale, where we have this wall of manifestos for the scale, which is kind of cool. We were in Beijing. We came, it's like this huge wall with the works there, to like being able to publish books that relate to those topics, like our book on narrative architecture that tries to address how representation can be used as a tool to subvert rather than to promote architecture, and how has been used in history to question it, right? And to more recent, contribution we did with the Platt Journal of Rice University, where they invited us to contribute to this issue on the divine, and we were like, do you know our work? Because the divine sounds kind of weird, but then we understood that they actually knew our work, right? And we end up doing this monument to the victims of capitalism as a poem to this monument with a couple of images. And that collage that you saw, that we started in our apartment long time ago to try to study the history of cities and utopia, right? Good and bad, and form making, took different forms from that like handmade collage at home to like a show in Lisbon. I don't even remember the year of this, 2015, maybe 2016, to like a larger version, this 2017, right? Now we're showing it in front of the things we're studying, which is interesting. Then in 2020, the date is wrong. This is actually not in Lisbon, it's in Nuremberg, in Germany. Much bigger version of it and updated, right, with some of those cities. So collage for us is a really important tool. And then after that, it's like, can it get bigger, the wall? Then we got another show invitation in the Centre Pompidou in Metz. And this one is the biggest wall, the biggest hanging wall in Europe, which is kind of funny. So it became even bigger. Even if the curator said, no, we're going to give you a smaller wall, after she came with this huge wall, made us make an even bigger file of this exhibition about utopia and science fiction, which is perfect for us, right? We could go there and study. It was a beautiful exhibition, very critical, right? Everything from Afrofuturism to fascism, right? And we have a chance to bring our students there to see it with us. Right. And then to this project that we're really happy that it exists, that is a Universal Principles of Architecture, is a book for the general public, which I think is the real value of it, where we can basically present to the general public not only questions about symmetry and, order and all the things that we usually learn, but questions about futurism, questions about like queer cartographies, what are like liberatory spaces, feminist spaces, critical spatial practices regarding feminism, spaces for accessibility, what is a building construction moratorium, right? Or what is a post-colonial architecture, right? So we can make the images, write the text that introduces this to the general public. What is a abolitionist architecture, right? And try to make this like normal, right? Like they're not really exceptional concepts, but rather things that we should be thinking about. So when you ask a kid, why would you like to be an architect? The answer is not always because I like science and math, but maybe because I like to disappear the prison system, because I hate the border wall, right? I think that those are really great ways to think about architecture. Relates to other publishing projects like Pure Hardcore Icons that we did, to study the role of form making and power in the history of architecture. We published this book in 2014, and we designed the book too, 2014, in London, and then it got translated a couple of years later in Beijing. And then relates to a couple of shows we did there in Beijing and in Berlin later, got translated into German and published by Arch Plus in 2014. Some architects really dislike us because they were putting this issue under our theory, including Pier Vittorio Aureli, which is whatever. It's his problem, not ours. Did a couple of shows in Berlin based on that, and those magazines that we were doing at the beginning keep coming back somehow. Sometimes takes the shape of like playgrounds and pavilions. And it goes also into another part of our work that is about trying to find a non-colonial language that doesn't mean stuff, but rather understanding form and language as a human possibility and a human capacity. And probably if you see my arms, people sometimes ask me, it's like, if you've been to our lectures, maybe you wouldn't be asking me the question about why my arms look the way they do. So there are poems, right, on form making. So that's something also that I think like at some point it started as a parallel practice, but it's really central to what we do, right? That is trying to address and develop a vocabulary and a language that tries to question the history of language. Relates to, we did this big project for a museum in Moscow back in 2016. We were one of the finalists. We were the only non-famous studio to be there. We got flown to Moscow twice to this museum. We didn't win, but then we came back and we applied some of the theories of this to a gallery we founded in Beijing. That used to be anti-profit gallery and non-commercial gallery, where we will have artists from all around the world making exhibitions.
Perhaps like somehow, without knowing it, it was kind of a start of a Loud Readers, because for us, what was the most important at that moment was like to have a space again to come together, to be able to show many different works of different mediums, different artists, and trying to exchange around that topic. We organize always like trying to organize a lot of public events, loud readings from the artist, and engage as much discussion as possible.
And out of these programs, sometimes there's a building that comes. Is a project we're designing for a trans poet in Puerto Rico called Roque Raquel Salas Rivera, maybe one of our most important contemporary poets that is also a collaborator. And trying to work with one of the concepts from one of his books, designing this house in his ancestral home in Mayagüez. That is where many layers of his family comes from. Also where his family was exploited, in the sugar plantations there, and working, with tropical materials and so on, as well as with some of the concepts like the tertiary that he writes about in his book. And then this is the second part of the presentation that is about the critique of post-colonial reason.
C'est pourquoi les analyses marxistes doivent être toujours légèrement distendues chaque fois qu'on déborde le problème colonial. Il n'y a pas jusqu'au concept de société précapitaliste, bien étudié par Marx, qui ne demanderait ici à être repensé.
And for the ones in Spanish, por eso que los análisis marxistas deben modificarse ligeramente siempre que se aborda el sistema colonial. And we started, for the ones that arrived late, you missed the fun part of Bad Bunny at the beginning. We write about Bad Bunny as an architectural theory too, and I'm glad that he's like reinforcing our belief in him since the beginning, now with what he's doing in Puerto Rico and so on. We wrote this article for the Avery a couple of years ago, before the New York Times did it actually. And we were talking about how this practice of radical loud reading in public, right, becomes a political act that connects to our colonial history, right, of the acts of resistance. Puerto Rico lost around 4,600 people in Hurricane Maria, which is a lot, right? It was all avoidable. It was mostly due to blackouts, water that was in bad state. And it really revealed the cruelty of coloniality, right? Of empire, which relates again, to Taliesin, to these histories of manifest destiny. I always imagine this image as the wall coming behind these women, right? Like flying over the landscape, bringing a school book, agriculture, and architecture with her, right? Which is kind of ironic also because it's called Columbia, these women, right? Like the university in which we also work. And like the films, like we always like consuming propaganda from empire, right? I don't know if you knew that this woman was the same one as this one, but here we are, right? We're trying to find the connections between all these systems of oppression, right? From Palestine to Ferguson to the Zapatistas, right? That they're right now in their struggle against the Mexican state, to the indigenous people in the Lakota, right? In the Dakota Access Pipeline, understanding what is the role of architecture in all of these, right? And it doesn't matter the style at the end of the day. You can have neoclassical, fascist architecture, but also at the same time, these fascist manifestations take place anywhere, right? It can be also in a modernist background, as it happened recently with the Jair Bolsonaro protests. So why are architects always, these architects always aligned with the systems of oppression, right? This is perhaps one of the dumbest books ever published in architecture, called Yes is More by B.R.K. Ingalls. And I mean, it's kind of wild when you see them working with people that will literally say that they'd rather see an extermination of indigenous people because they're standing in the middle of progress and development, right? Or when architects say such stupid things as proposing to cover the entire planet with an inhabitable biostructure. Isn't that what the planet already is? Which is like saying, I want to make a planet in the planet. Or the other one that calls it master planet. Somebody didn't send him the memo. Or people like Elon Musk that said that we will coup whoever we want, deal with it, when they talk about the extraction of lithium in Bolivia. Understanding what is our role in this, right? When we have like sub-Saharan Africans protesting for better rights in France because they're building the headquarters of Le Monde, right? The architectural headquarters designed by Snøhetta. And until where our solidarities lie. Yeah, I want architects to have a better living wage. I would rather them not be building prisons while they're doing that, right? Or building border walls, right? So understanding that sometimes that's why we question history and time. Time is not linear and also doesn't necessarily move forward, right? Sometimes it feels like it's stuck. And we can see that in the things that are happening around us, right? Also understanding that we need if we have icons, we need other icons. And I used to say this when I was lecturing in Zoom, that I feel privileged to be lecturing behind a computer screen and not behind bulletproof glass, right? Which is the case sometimes where you are trying to deal with white supremacy. Again, I come from the world's oldest colony. This is an image of Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. And you can see the similarities now, right? With the death toll, the miscalculation, the complete lack of the complete neglect, right, towards life, and compare it. Look at Palestine, right? There's like medical journals that have estimated there are over 200,000 people dead there, right? It's just, and as we're speaking, they're still getting killed, right? Like children getting eviscerated. So what is the liberation then, right? I love this manifesto by the Feminist Collective in Construction in Puerto Rico on a t-shirt that says anti-patriarchal, feminist, lesbian, trans, Caribbean, Latin American, right? I think somewhere along those lines, liberation may lie, right? They're the ones that are doing all the anti-displacement protests. They're the ones organizing, right? In Puerto Rico, when we commission a lot of the essays for our land back journal, almost all Puerto Rican authors wrote about Palestine, right? They didn't write about Puerto Rico. They don't need to write about Puerto Rico, right? Like we know about Puerto Rico already. What they're trying to highlight is that these struggles are interconnected, right? Like there's no way where we can be free if not everybody is free, right? And they've been doing a lot of activism, right? Like against the violent state that murders women, in Puerto Rico, but also in Palestine, against in Mexico, right, in Guatemala, in Brazil. So there's that, right, learning about solidarity, learning from the people that are practicing it and teaching us, mostly not in architecture school, mostly anti-racist, indigenous, and Black women, right? So how do we go about this? Then what are the architectures of undoing and unmaking, right? Not everything is about building something up, right? If that something up is toxic and it's killing you. So part of our practice consists on looking at those systems, right? Looking where does architecture lies. And sometimes you may find out that architecture is the enemy, right? And this is something that we have to be aware. We are all capable of horrible things. And if we're not conscious, we may be participating in these systems, right? So how do we think about them? How do we dismantle them? How do we render them visible? How do we undo them? How do we understand that it's inseparable ecological spoliation from white supremacy, from heteropatriarchy, from the violence of the state, from the pipelines, right? From the indigenous people being murdered and disappeared, but also with them bringing racist monuments down. What does that look like? What does that world beyond racist monuments look like? What are the real democratic acts of architecture where people come together to bring down monuments that were never democratically erected, right? So we invite people to look at these things, right? We do it through our own programming when we invite people to talk to us in different events. We try to do it in the streets. I had done it in the streets, right? I've been in the streets 2020 when we were talking about the role of architecture in these systems of oppression. We try to do it in the publications we do. And this you can download online for free. It's a manual of anti-racist architecture education. It's published in English and Spanish. Right now it's being translated to Portuguese. I wish I can call it Brazilian. And it has, tying all those problematic histories. Yes, we have to know about them, but we also should be able to criticize them, right? Why do I need a new European Bauhaus? Wasn't the old Bauhaus European enough? What are the roles of the Bauhaus as an education system that basically segregated men and women from their disciplines, right? Why do we learn from Johannes Itten believed that the path to eternal living was racial purity. Therefore, he designed an exercise for the white man, how to make a perfect house for the white man. That's where the little cube we make in architecture school comes from, right? Which is very bizarre that we're still doing those exercises. How do we question the legacy of the singular male genius that is going to save us and replace it with other forms of education? How do we address that? Most of the things that I'm talking to you about today are banned in Iowa or in Texas or in Florida, right? I'm constantly fighting with the universities in which I work. Like literally, I had to call lawyers. I had to talk to people, civil rights lawyers. I had to call to activists because it's insane. Even if they tell you something, sometimes nobody's going to protect you, and the bus is going to run over you, right? So you have to really be educated about what are your rights and what rights you don't have, which are plenty, right? I always show this. This is the bill in Iowa that they passed, basically banning everything we teach about, right? But since it's inseparable from architecture, they cannot do much other than make our lives a living hell. We try to map all these systems, right, by reclaiming the tools of the oppressor. We had a very strange exchange with the Jenks Foundation where they commissioned us an essay, and they were not happy that we were calling Charles Jenks a racist in his texts because it was the daughter who was commissioning us. At the end, the essay became much longer because we were trying to prove the point, and we prove it, right? They were not happy, but they had to deal with it, right? I think like when we do that type of thing, then we realize that it has value what we're doing, right? Because the institutions are not very happy about it. This is the text. You can find it in the Jenks Foundation, right? And develop all these tools like diagrams that try to measure everything from our curriculum to the cost of studying architecture. Like, we should be talking about how expensive it is. Why is education so expensive, right? Mostly on stolen land. Comparing some of those toxic universities, their endowments with the whole GDPs of entire countries. That's also wild to look at, right? That's all in that manual that relates to all these questions, right? And then as we move now to the last project that we want to talk to you about, it's a big project that connects to the plantation in the Caribbean, right? Where we try to learn from these images of genocide where indigenous people are basically erased, right? To make these bucolic postcards to invite colonizers to settle and to transform nature, right? We want to imagine what other forms are out there. So we started making all these installations where we reinsert the militarized architectures in these landscapes to talk about those hidden histories. We founded a collective called Postnovis, I'm going to talk to you about in a second. And this practice of loud reading that was born in the tobacco factories at the beginning of the 20th century, where the former enslaved and low-wage workers who were denied any means of formal education would pick one of their own to read for them during the entire workday. At the beginning, the practice mostly done by men. They would loud read classics, but then later with people like Luisa Capetillo, a feminist syndico-anarchist, an utopian author, would not only loud read Karl Marx and Engels and Kropotkin and Bakunin, bringing like anarchist and communist philosophy and socialist philosophy. She will also loud read her own utopian fictions where workers will rob banks and live happily ever after in the countryside, eating delicious vegetarian meals. So it was an invitation, right, to foster an anti-colonial, anti-capitalist imagination. In 2019, we co-founded with former students and some friends that are writers this collective called Postnovis that comes from post-colonial novis. And we started making propaganda, right, trying to recruit people like you around the world to join some form of anti-colonial revolution, right? We will make all these posters. We will make installations where we loud read to the people, feminist manifestos, anti-colonial manifestos. This is the first one we did in Omaha. Co-publish a book together with our students and with Luis Antonio Rosa, that is the director of ethnic studies in University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where we used to work. And then the practice will meet not in a cyclical time like colonial time, but rather in spiral time, right? So we meet in different places around the world. We will turn our lectures like this one in Carnegie Mellon in an installation like the one we have here, right? As part of that propaganda. We will make antidisciplinary installations where we will make collective plays, present them in digital platforms like this museum in Virginia. We will publish books with our students and with our collaborators, like this one called The Planetary Wretched, a post-colonial narrative architecture poetry book. And writers will be making architecture, and architects will be writing, and filmmakers will be making pictures, and nobody has a discipline, right? This is one of the cadaver esquisses we did with some of our collaborators. There's 10 members, including Emma is the youngest one. This is her piece. And with many students all around the world, again, like expanding these discourses in exhibitions, in Iowa State, or this one when we flooded a gallery in Vienna to make a tropical stage for the play. This is in Magazine, that is a gallery of contemporary architecture in Vienna. And we had a room that was flooded for the play to take place, and then a room for distributing anti-colonial propaganda. And we will loud read here, like Paulo Freire and Fanon and Capetillo, right? So people will come to this space, and it will be a library that we will install inside with all the propaganda on the walls, right? We're trying to make the revolution beautiful and seductive in the same way that the colonizers make propaganda, right? That's why the tropical fruits are always present, right? Has that origin in the plantations of the Caribbean. We found this even African mask in some of those markets that are in Europe. Kind of very bizarre stories I learned while going in them. Is Paulo Freire, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. So they're translated to different languages depending where we do these installations.
We also create like one part also of Postnovis, and the idea also behind Light Reader is also creating an archive that can go to sharing bibliography, creating syllabus for some of our members, to also having this platform online that we started in 2019, and where we
2020.
where we also have like a series of events. Sometimes it takes place in a week, and it's like with a series of workshops, discussions, but lectures, or sometimes also it's more spread out, but it's ongoing project. And the idea also is to have all the time all the material accessible, also materials for workshops too that you can download.
In the same way that the workers took the space of capitalist exploitation, that was the factory of tobacco, we take our space of exploitation and propaganda, that is the university and its platforms, in this case Zoom, right? To basically subvert it and open it up, right? So when COVID hit, that the universities many times in a very cruel way send the students packing. We were working in Carnegie Mellon back then, and a lot of students that were international students end up living in parts of Pittsburgh that they didn't even know about, right? Because the university has kept them secret from them. We wanted to offer a public platform of education, right? So we basically took the Zoom from the university, made them pay for it, buy us some microphones, and we started this public online school of architecture, right? Not based on like making ourselves more efficient, but rather to question what we were doing, right?
And there's a component also, like going back to the inspiration of Luisa Capetillo. What was interesting is like beyond also being lectores, she was organizing so much a workshop with the workers of the factory. They were collectively producing plays, writing, and so on. So also how when we describe loud reading, so loud reading also has like so many different components of it, which include also like, as we were saying, like extending the collective, making together, which also is very important for us.
Right. So at the end, the readings, the workshops that are offered are creating a curriculum and a syllabi that is not based on questioning or like subverting Eurocentric canon, but rather creating what we need to know in order to address the questions we find urgent, right? And I think like talking about, Tijuanan artists, philosophers, right? Sayak Valencia from Tijuana that writes about the border is a really central philosopher to the things we're doing, right? Or Raquel Salas Rivera, Angela Davis, Achille Bembe, again, relates to this series of loud readers. And then an invitation for you to join us, right? We launched last year with the support of a couple of foundations, including the Mellon Foundation, REARC Institute. We launched the first in-person iteration of the Loud Readers Trade School, in which we call it Escuela Vocacional, no? We try to treat architecture not as a discipline for the few elites, right? But something that is, we all always living in architecture, but somehow there's only a few of us that can think about it, right? So we wanted to make it into a vocational school, a trade school. And we launched the first iteration of the in-person school is free to attend, right? And we with the funding we get, we design all these furnitures that are going to transform a space into a workshop, and then pay fellowships to speakers and philosophers and writers and architects and planners from all the broader regions that relate to the questions we're asking, bring them to Puerto Rico. And like Loud Readers is Afro and gay and queer and lesbian and transfeminist and diasporic and Caribbean and Latin American and anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, anti-patriarchal, collective, emancipatory, anti-ableist, solidary, and right, we make all these maps, invite in the first iteration all the speakers. Comunal, that comes from here, from Mexico. Mariana Ordóñez Grajales is from Chetumal, which is also in the Caribbean, right? Alice Grandroy, that is from Haiti. Island City Lab from Jamaica. Jason Fitzroy Jeffers is an amazing filmmaker from Barbados. And we designed with our collective Post Novis all this furniture, right, that we have, and we're going to use to install these classrooms. And it's, a library for emancipation, a workshop, a tribune, a display, a table, a composition, a playground, a screen, a seat, and transform the gallery of the architecture school that usually has been historically un espacio excluyente, no, an exclusive space, turn it into an open garden, right, where we can share all these emancipatory imaginaries, right? Here, the tropical plants make sense, right, because we are in the tropics. But there's still a subversion of the institution, right? We map where we all come from, and then we go. It was the 10-day workshop. So for 10 days, we have like 3 or 4 events per day. It was very exhausting. And it was maybe the most transformative experience for, I think, all of us that were there. There were a Guyanese student that came from Paris, a Bolivian student that flew from Canada. There were people that came that are agroecologists, agroecological activists from Puerto Rico were there. It was a really diverse crowd across ages and groups and languages, right? Spoken and understood. And we had this 10-day amazing workshops, you know, on like patriarchal violences in the body and the land, on exercises of translation with translators and poets, questions about philosophies of liberation, histories of colonialism in different contexts, you know. I love this quote, you know, with Isabel Jolicoeur, that is from Haiti, when she talks about like being an architect in Haiti means taking place in foreign dominated decision-making spaces. It means grabbing a seat at the table where you are often not invited, even though you are the main subject of the conversation, right? Everybody's always talking about Haiti. Haitians are almost never involved, right? So these are some of the images of those workshops. Sometimes they took place in the classroom. Sometimes we went to the museum to watch film curated by Jason Fitzroy. Or we did this, maybe for me personally, the most transforming exercise I did coming from Puerto Rico. I grew up like 10 minutes from the beach, was going underwater with Nadia Huggins. That is a artist base. She's the daughter of an architect by coincidence, born in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And she's been documenting life underwater in the Caribbean, right? Especially in St. Vincent. For me to be able to see live, and as she rightfully claims, you know, the most indigenous landscapes of the Caribbean are underwater, are the ones that have changed the less in the last 500 years, but they're still being affected by climate change, right? So we could go underwater with these waterproof cameras we bought for everybody and get underwater to document it. I saw life there actually for the first time. I've seen fish, but I've never seen the diversity of life just 3 steps away from shore, right? That we don't even think about when we take decisions. We had workshops on like queer monuments. Here's Emma with her monument. Workshops on bomba. That is our African indigenous music, right? Especially most of the narratives of liberation happen through music with bomba. Right, again, across ages, you know, like there were kids and children doing the workshops. It was really like beautiful example of what education could be, right? I always wonder, there's no reason why children are not learning about architecture and what it could be, right? We and the penultimate day we went to La Impresora, that is to the west coast of Puerto Rico, northwest coast of Puerto Rico, to do a workshop with independent press run by 2 women, feminist women, that run this amazing independent press with a risograph printers. So we did a risograph workshop of all the things we developed through the 10 days. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Of course, what can I say? It's amazing what all the series of bombardment of all the different perspectives and ways to think about and reflect what we're doing, right? I don't want to, like I said, I don't want to take over and kind of just ask me the question, and I know the time is limited, so I want to open it to the public to have questions. I have several, but I will hold myself. So anybody who wants to have questions, please do.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Buenas tardes. Soy estudiante de arquitectura en Ibero-Tijuana. Es una pregunta respecto a la conferencia pasada, pero tiene mucho que ver con lo que vimos ahorita. Cuando mencionabas que por qué decimos que Tijuana tiene 130 años o que es muy joven, yo como tijuanense, pues lo que veo es que en sí creo que Tijuana ni siquiera tiene esa edad. Creo que fue algo más conveniencia histórica, porque se supone que hace 130 años los hermanos Argüello, que son como los fundadores, entre comillas, de Tijuana, se repartieron las tierras mediante un documento. Entonces por eso se dice que tiene 130 años, pero pues hay como no mucha claridad al respecto. Mi pregunta es, pues nos han enseñado como tijuanenses, pues que sí, que tenemos 130 años y de ahí para atrás no se sabe mucho. ni siquiera se sabe de dónde viene la palabra Tijuana, se cree que es por la Tijuana o por una palabra en Kumiai, creo. Mi pregunta es, ¿qué nos recomendarías con toda esa experiencia que ya tienen en estos ámbitos como tijuanenses para, pues, como envolvernos un poquito más en nuestra historia y a lo mejor quitarnos un poco esa idea de que somos una ciudad joven? Porque es cierto, o sea, no somos una ciudad joven, a lo mejor desde la visión urbanista o desde cierta perspectiva, a lo mejor como concepto de ciudad, pues sí lo somos, pero como población o como área geográfica con gente ahí, pues ya viene detrás, ¿no? Tal vez sea porque hay muchos migrantes y por ahí se dice que como no hay una identidad tijuanense porque nadie es de Tijuana nativamente, a lo mejor por eso, pero como migrantes o como personas que nuestros padres o abuelos llegaron a Tijuana, ¿qué nos recomiendas como para tratar de indagar un poquito más y no sé, abrazar un poquito esa cultura tijuanense que va más allá de los 130 años?
Claro, claro. No, esta es súper fantástica pregunta y yo creo que voy a hacer referencia a una amiga palestina que se llama Dimas Ruji. Ella trabaja en los museos que desaparecen su historia, ¿no? Like she works in the museums that disappear her history. She's a Palestinian friend. There's an amazing designer, architect too. Y ella dice que su rol dentro de la institución no es hacerla más clara ni que se explique mejor, sino confundirla. Y a mí, yo invitaría a la confusión, invitaría a los discursos no oficiales. I will invite people to, rather than trying to make the job of the state easier in making these very straightforward narratives about history, you complicate it. You try to confuse it. Tratar de encontrar cuáles son las cosas que no hacen sentido y exacerbarlas. Tratar de ver qué las historias orales son tan importantes, porque muchas veces, casi siempre van en contra de la versión oficial del Estado, ¿no? El Estado dice, no, pues en el 130 aquí empieza todo, liberación siempre es una liberación súper hispanofílica, ¿no? Hasta Emiliano Zapata, ¿no? Que muy macharrán, todas las estatuas en caballos, ¿no? Siempre es una historia bien narrada desde la perspectiva de los hombres, ¿no? De la liberación y qué sé yo. That's not real, ¿no? So, I will say, speaking, accounting for non-written histories, right? Necesitamos desarrollar una métrica o métricas que nos alejen de la oficialidad colonial, ¿no? Que es lo que no eres sujeto histórico si no estás aprobado por esas métricas, ¿no? Y tenemos que cuestionarnos, ¿no? Inclusive los centros que son mayormente responsables de esas historias son los museos, las universidades, ¿no? Que te enseñan la historia, casi siempre, una historia, quote unquote, occidental, ¿no? ¿Qué historias hay ahí? ¿Qué grupos originarios habían en la región, por ejemplo? ¿Saben quiénes estaban ahí? Hay varios, ¿no? Casi nunca solo uno, ¿no? Hay varias historias que se entrelazan, ¿no? ¿Dónde están sus narrativas? ¿Hay espacio en la versión oficial para esas narrativas? ¿Hay espacios para versiones contradictorias? ¿Y qué herramientas tenemos para permitir esas contradicciones, ¿no? Los libros oficiales no son el espacio necesario para eso. Quizás hay, for us, haciendo collages, haciendo narrativas, escribiendo poesía, hablando con historiadores orales, hablando con la gente que existe, ¿no? Con los descendientes de esos grupos que han sido totalmente marginalizados y erradicados, ¿no? de las versiones oficiales del Estado. ¿Cómo podemos entablar conversaciones sobre la historia y el tiempo, ¿no? Cuando la historia y el tiempo es el vehículo que se utiliza para desaparecerlos, ¿no? Y creo que es una oportunidad más para ser creativo, ¿no? No sé qué fórmula haces, pero no puede ser la que está ahí. Vas a tener que como conversar y tratar de fabricar metodologías, ¿no? Que nos permitan explorar esas vertientes y cuando no aparezca, pues nos las inventamos. The official history is always invented.
I mean, history is very subjective.
Right? We started with history doesn't exist. History is a fabrication.
Because, yeah, exactly, like who is writing history? What do we have access of? The archive of history was an archive. I think also like that's why we are so critical about the idea of archive, and that's why it's so important, as Cruz just mentioned, also to try to find your own ways to create a counter archive, right? And this one could have as like different methodologies, ideas of living platform, living spaces for the one who can tell the story, not the one that historically always tells the story from above, right? Or from another perspective, and have access to a lot of, as we're saying, that's why also like in our work, publishing or all these different medias are very important, because they leave, the idea is like they leave traces, right? We want to offer the context history, right? The one that we want to hear or share or collect.
La Contrahistoria de Tijuana. That sounds like a great book already. Somebody have the hand raised here somewhere.
Hola, gracias por su lectura. Mi nombre es María y pienso sobre los animales en referencia de arquitectura. Entonces, algunas relativas no pueden hablar por su propio y pueden decir sobre integrating animals. And I know you talk a lot about tropical plants, but I feel like, and I really enjoyed the graphic of the mask that you showed.
That's the next level. Like So first of all, I will say, primero diría que animales somos, ¿no? No creo que, no pienso de otras especies separados de nosotros, but we've been working a lot with, hemos estado trabajando recientemente mucho con activistas nativoamericanos en la región de los Great Plains, y hablan mucho de Rise of Nature y de relaciones entre parientes, y creo que nos hace falta, and this for me, you know, I am an alienated person from myself. I don't know where I come from. I have very little. That's why I got underwater for the first time at 40 years old, and I cry because I see fish and living things, even if I grew up in front of it. Right? That's a very designed thing for us. I feel like many of us feel that way. If you leave me in a forest, I'll die like in 15 minutes because I don't know how to survive. Right? I will say that there needs to be a conscious exercise on our behalf, right? That we're working on it, of course, to reconsider our ontologies, how we understand the world and our relationship to it. I think like that sort of separation of nature and human is a very Eurocentric, you know, colonial approach to nature. And yes, you know, like I went to Egan Felicia, that is a Muskogee eco village in Alabama, and it transformed my life because I saw what land back by the force and as a practice of culture and language looks like. And there are relatives, right? And they have reintroduced the bison, the buffalo. They have reintroduced the sturgeon. I touched a sturgeon. Sturgeon has no scales. They're like before fish has scales, right? These fish have been here for so long, they don't have scales. I touched it. And el líder de científico que está allí, que es un activista Muskogee, no permite que hablen inglés frente al sturgeon, right? Nobody was allowed to speak English in front of the sturgeon. Solamente puedes hablar o español or whatever other language, but not that particular language, right? And it made me also think about that relationship. Like I felt sad in a way that I didn't have any. Like I only have pets, right? And I feel like they're family, but I don't know them that well, right? So I don't know my family that well. And I think that we are now maybe in a stage of our life where we are reconsidering a bunch of things, and especially working with indigenous activists, like trabajando con activistas indígenas, nos está haciendo que reconsideremos muchas cosas en nuestras relaciones, ¿no? And these things are happening, maybe we talk about it in the classroom, but they're actually happening in life, right? Trying to think how we can, you know, yesterday a friend of mine, Luis Otoniel, that is one of our collaborators, one of the co-founders of Loud Readers and Post Novis, he called me to tell me that his brother-in-law he left me this really long message, basically. They have purchased a bunch of acres in Puerto Rico, and they are making this based on the Zapatista model. They're making some policies, right? And trying to think about land stewardship and they're gonna have land that they're gonna like only a certain percentage, very low, it can be used for production. Everything else is gonna be to rewilding it somehow. And it makes me like, it's very hopeful. Me da esperanza, but also for me, it's like a very daunting thing. Like, we are being confronted with ourselves, right? I think we are in a moment in history. I showed one of the Puerto Rican indigenous activists we invited, Pluma. We invited her to the university. It was the first time in the history of the university. I think the university is like around 130 years old. It's not as old as the ones in Mexico, for example, right? That an indigenous activist is invited to the university. So imagine this, right? We have been denied of our own condition, right? So I think there's a lot of transformation taking place, but it's a process that is quite traumatizing, right? Because then you see some of your relatives, they're doing it, and then you're like, but why can't I do this? Is the right platform to be in the classroom in architecture school? Maybe not, right? So hopefully animals are being part. We write about it a bit in this book in a way. But yeah, like we're thinking about it, but mostly seeing how people are doing it. Reintroducing, I think the introduction of the buffalo, reintroduction of the red wolf, that sturgeon thing, and we're learning, the good thing about being teachers is that our students are always doing research. No. ¿En dónde? And they're working with the herons? Yes. Yes. Con las ramas. Ramas. Oh.
Movement around protecting the herring from the commercial fishing, which takes the females out of the water, slits open their bellies.
Yeah. Yeah, capitalism is not a very beautiful thing, I have to say. But yeah.
And also gardens, for something that I'm really passionate about and wanting to bring to this region is jardines de
Clams? Almejas.
Yeah, and they have a process where designing the slope of the beach, and obviously it can be dangerous depending on the water, but it also helps to clean the water.
I think something that very, very important about when we think about animals too is always think about the people that are actually the stewards of the animals, because sometimes what happens too is that there's a separation between the practice and the people, right? And everything can be turned into a commodity. And I would say, like, maybe that's the thing that we try to be more careful, is that every time that we're thinking about something, it's like, who's actually doing this? And can we leave space for that to happen with the actual people, right? Which is always that relationship, right? That there's no them and us, but rather all together. But this sounds really awesome. Thank you. Yes.
Nos gustaría saber qué fue lo que los empujó o influyó en ustedes para unir pues la arquitectura y el diseño con estos temas sociales o humanistas.
What motivated us to like work with like
First, I didn't say that, but I want to apologize because I do understand Spanish, but my Spanish is not as
okay.
good.
It's better than my French.
So I would love, I hope I can one day reply in better Spanish. But I think it was for both of us, that was something that was there from very young. Like, I feel like it's like, like we were saying anger early on, but I think it is like something, that makes you feel uncomfortable with how you see society going around you. And I think because we had this, and both growing up, and I think that's also what made our practice in a way. Because when we were just out of school and we started to be in those bubbles, right? But we're trying to see architecture as being apolitical, which is a total fiction, right? Because nothing is apolitical. So I think that also like motivated us a lot in the different works that we do. And I think like also, as we were saying, like, so meeting other people and art of architecture for us was like also very inspirational, meeting activists, meeting people that, you know, live this every day, that are outside, not just in a classroom, right? As we're saying, also like being more critical about how we think about the education around architecture and so on.
And to be honest, also, it took a couple of moments where there's a struggle. Like, we were really political. I was really political. I was raised for a dad that made me really conscious about like a racial struggle, class struggle when I was little, right? So I have t-shirts when I was a kid, you know, of the Black Panthers and Malcolm X, right? So I knew who they were since I was very small. And you live through racism in Puerto Rico, so it's not really like shocking or a surprise, but it prepares you. I think I was very politically engaged when I was in school. Then I got in that because the elevator story I told, my architectural education is different than all my classmates because I entered in an odd year. I had a program specially made for me because I was in the track team. I cannot take studio the first year, so I took a lot of my classes were outside of architecture school. It took me a couple of years in architecture school to find myself. So I got lost, right? They're talking to me about Le Corbusier and all these like white dudes that I have nothing in common with, that I will never do what they do because the conditions are so completely different and kind of irrelevant in a way that it shocked me and it alienated me from it, right? Like I felt like I like drawing, but I don't see what purpose does this has to do with I grew up. That's why I didn't know an architect growing up, right? And it was not until I started taking Spanish classes with writers that were, I would ask them, what happened in the 60s? And they would explain to me in depth across, you know, from the protests of the students in Mexico to Paris to the Black Panthers, right? That I would be like, I like to do this in the thing that I'm doing, right? And then I could put them together, right? And, you know, later, fourth year, fifth year, my thesis, you know, fall into that, right? And start to understand that you have a political agency, understanding that maybe my classmates in architecture are the traitors when the humanities students and the sociales students are protesting against the police and against privatization, but the architects always just want to graduate and get a job. And I was like, I don't align with this. I align with the humanities ones. They call them los pelus revoltosos, right? Like, because they have like a lot of hair and they're always making protests, right? And I'm like, yeah, I love that. You know, I identify much more with them than with like our wealthier kids that want to get a job, right? And then there was a third shock going into work, right? We were working and it's like, I hate this. I completely despise, first of all, we're getting extracted and exploited. And then I have no relationship to this system of extraction. I want nothing to do with it in a way, right? So while we were working, we were running our parallel practice of trying to ask questions, you know, trying to find a meaning in what we're doing, because otherwise it's quite sad, you know, that you're like, you hate something so much, but then you're doing that exactly, right? So there is the political you, right? But then you need to figure out a way how to make that space within a profession that has historically been a tool of oppression, right? I think like that maybe summarizes some moments about that. Does it help? Okay.
Kind of. I think we have some other questions or somebody? Yeah.
So thank you so much for the presentation. Muchas gracias por la presentación. So thinking about using the institutions as a way to create change and using and finding your space in these systems of oppression, pensando cómo utilizar las instituciones y cómo crear cambio dentro de esas instituciones opresivas. In 2016, I interpreted for the Popular Education Project with Claudia de la Cruz, which is currently running for the Party for Socialism and Liberation. En el 2016 interpreté para un proyecto de educación popular con Claudia de la Cruz, que estaban hablando de temas de liberación. They were talking about themes of liberation. And I hear we're 2 weeks away from the election, and I hear this rhetorica, obviously Trump is an asshole, piece of shit. Obviamente Trump es una persona horrible, pero También no me siento como con conciencia limpia votando por Kamala Harris porque actualmente ahorita están bombardeando Palestina y hay muchas cosas que no estoy de acuerdo. So currently, we hear this dynamic of, Kamala Harris is supporting, Israel and is currently bombing. But then we also know Trump is set to do horrible things. También escuchamos que Trump va a hacer cosas terribles. So how do you feel about this thing? Because I feel this thing like Claudia de la Cruz aligns with, what I believe in. Claudia de la Cruz se alinea con lo que yo creo, but then I'm terrified of Trump getting in power, pero también tengo terror de que Trump entre en poder. Entonces, he estado con esta dinámica que no sé qué hacer so I'm with this dynamic of I don't know what to do, also recognizing that Puerto Ricans can't vote, también reconociendo el hecho que los puertorriqueños no pueden votar. Entonces, entiendo que tengo privilegio de votar. I understand I have a privilege to vote. So this has just been on my mind, and I feel like I have to share it. Está en mi mente, quiero compartirlo. Gracias.
Yeah, this is awesome, and it's not out of context, right? Because I actually have students that ask me the same question, which is also interesting. And I think what you say, like, if you live in Puerto Rico, you cannot vote, right? So when I say that we're the oldest colony, I mean it in a full, complete way, right? Like, I understand on democratic processes, right? I understand the gaslighting that goes with it. I understand when you say working with institutions, I'm literally like fighting with my own institutions, right? In many different ways. And I will say, so there's two things that I had to like explain. First, I don't think that US is a country. I think it's a settler colonial state with many different nations inside, and the Meskwaki are there, and there's like Black people, and there's Latino people, and people are oppressed at different stages, right? With this settler colonial military state, right? That their business is to spread death around the world, right? And they're very good at that, right? I think that's the only thing that the US is actually leading is in death, right? The other one, I don't believe that a system of democracy that comes from owning slaves, right? The Electoral College was designed to give representation to people that own other people, right? When people have property, they made an Electoral College to say, like, I own all these slaves, but they shouldn't vote, but you have to count them, right? That's a representation democratic, right? That's the Electoral College. I don't believe these things are working in our favor, right? So I will, as a conscious thing, you do what your consciousness tell you, and also we need to work towards, if we want a democracy, we need to work towards having a democracy, because we never had one, right? Like, you cannot have a democracy based on slavery. I don't know if you know this, but slavery is still legal in the US, right? The 13th Amendment made an exception with the prison system. And we are in California, right? That employs a ridiculous amount of prisoners to produce stuff for like 75 cents an hour, right? So I don't believe that's a democratic system. But we have to make, whatever choices we make for whatever conveniences, momentary conveniences are, but the system has to come down, whatever that happens in between is not the way to go. So you're in a blue state, you shouldn't worry too much. Just vote whoever you want.
Okay. Well, I think we are at the end of the talk.
One more.
I think we are. Sorry, we are. Yeah, you have to make it super short. We have to make it super short. Yeah, because we're already at the limit. Sorry, we have time constraints in that thing. So I think you can have a conversation afterwards. Okay. So thank you so much. I just want to kind of close in the remarks and saying it was a 2-day event, right? I know a lot of you stuck out to the whole marathon of conversations, and I really appreciate all the effort that you did in work in the thing. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for coming.